Welcome to our channel, where we unravel the most chilling tales from the unknown. Tonight's story will make you think twice about that camping trip you've been planning, especially if it's to a remote, secluded lake. Let's dive into the story of James and Laura and their eerie experience at Midnight Lake, a hidden, isolated spot in the heart of Europe's wild, untouched forests. Let's get into it. James and Laura Foster were a young, adventurous couple who shared a love for the outdoors. Always looking for the next undiscovered place, they decided to spend a weekend at Midnight Lake, a remote and mysterious lake deep in the forests of Central Europe. It was said that this lake was so far from civilization that only the most rugged campers dared to explore it. They'd heard rumors of eerie lights and ghostly figures in the water, but they brushed it off as folklore, just stories passed down by locals to scare tourists away. They arrived just as the sun was setting, and Midnight Lake was everything they'd hoped for. Serene, still, and untouched, surrounded by dense, towering trees. They set up camp right by the lake's edge, breathing in the cool, crisp air, and appreciating the solitude. As night fell, they sat around a small fire, laughing and sharing stories, letting their voices carry out into the empty wilderness. But as the evening wore on, the lake began to take on an eerie quality. It was then that Laura first noticed strange, faint lights flickering above the water. She nudged James, intrigued, and insisted they take a closer look. The lights were soft, like tiny embers floating in the air, but they seemed to have a life of their own. As they watched, the lights shifted and almost seemed to form patterns on the surface of the lake. Laura's curiosity turned to fascination. She leaned closer, her eyes fixated on the lights that seemed to dance in the darkness. And then, as James looked over her shoulder, he saw something that sent a chill through him. Just for a moment, he saw a face in the water. Small, ghostly, with hollow eyes that looked back at him from beneath the surface. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the image lingered. Laura, entranced, suggested they stay longer by the water, but James managed to coax her back to the tent. He wanted to shake off the feeling of unease that was creeping over him, to pretend the lights and faces were just tricks of the mind. They crawled into their sleeping bags, but sleep didn't come easily. In the middle of the night, James awoke to a strange silence, as if the world outside had frozen. He reached over, but Laura wasn't beside him. His heart pounded as he scrambled out of the tent, calling her name. His voice echoed into the night, but there was no answer. Panic rose in his chest, and he searched frantically along the shore, looking for any sign of her. Just as he was about to give up, he heard her voice, faint, distorted, coming from somewhere across the lake. It sounded like Laura, yet not quite like her. There was an odd, hollow quality to it, almost as if something else were speaking through her. He followed the sound, desperate to find her, and then he saw something that made his blood run cold. Near the water's edge, he found Laura's clothes, laid out in a neat pile, but there was no trace of her. The water was still dark, as if holding secrets just beneath the surface. Lost and scared, he stumbled back to the tent, hoping she'd somehow returned. And there, inside, was Laura, sitting motionless, staring blankly at nothing. Relief flooded him, but it quickly turned to dread. She looked pale, almost translucent, her skin damp and clammy to the touch. When he asked where she'd gone, she just blinked at him, her gaze distant, her expression empty. She insisted she hadn't left the tent and claimed she didn't even remember seeing the lake at all. As dawn broke, James hoped the strange night would fade into memory, that the daylight would dispel whatever horror had visited them. But as he stepped outside the tent, he noticed two sets of footprints leading to the lake, his own and another set that looked like hers. Yet something about them was wrong. The steps were too large, too wide, as though someone had tried to mimic her stride but had failed. He tried to brush it off, but Laura's behavior grew stranger by the hour. She barely spoke, didn't eat, and moved in a stiff, unnatural way. When he reached for her hand, she pulled away as if his touch burned her. By nightfall, he was a wreck, trying to figure out what was happening. He slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares, and when he awoke in the middle of the night, Laura was gone again. Heart racing, he grabbed a flashlight and headed back to the lake. This time, he was determined to find her and put an end to the strangeness. As he scanned the shoreline with his flashlight, he saw her standing waist-deep in the lake, her body facing him, but her head tilted to one side, her gaze vacant. Her eyes looked through him, lifeless and empty. He called her name, hoping she'd come to her senses, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly tilted her head, a hollow look in her eyes, as though she were a puppet awaiting instructions. Then, as he watched, another figure rose from the water beside her. It took him a moment to recognize the ghostly face, but when he did, he felt paralyzed with horror. The figure was him, a decayed, twisted version of himself, eyes wide with a look of terror frozen on his face. The two figures stared at him, motionless, before disappearing beneath the surface. James stumbled back, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. When he returned to the tent, he found Laura again, but she was different. Her hair was streaked with mud, her fingers wrinkled and pale as if she'd been submerged for hours. She insisted she didn't remember anything, but her voice was lower, her words fragmented. As they packed up to leave, she leaned close, her voice barely a whisper, asking, "Did you see them too?" Her question felt like a secret, one she wasn't supposed to know. They managed to leave Midnight Lake, but the horrors they had encountered seemed to follow them. Laura would stare for hours at her own reflection, and sometimes James would catch glimpses of his own reflection acting wrong. It would shift subtly, move when he was still, smile when he was emotionless. In quiet moments, he would hear Laura speaking to herself in low whispers, muttering phrases he didn't recognize, words in a voice not entirely her own. Months passed, and they tried to move on, to forget about Midnight Lake, but then Laura disappeared again. This time, it was from their own home. All that remained were damp footprints leading from the house and the faint, haunting smell of lake water. Driven to desperation, James returned to Midnight Lake, hoping to find her, to confront whatever had taken her. As he reached the lake, he saw a young family camping nearby, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking beneath the surface. He tried to warn them, but just then, he saw his reflection in the water. It stared back at him, cold and twisted, wearing a knowing, sinister smile. The lake had taken something from him, something he could never reclaim. He'd never truly left Midnight Lake. It was part of him now, and he could feel its dark, patient pull drawing him back. So, next time you find yourself near an isolated lake, remember? Some places hold on to the souls that venture too close, and some reflections are more than they seem. Midnight Lake is still there, waiting, and it keeps what it wants,